Before we ride into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. Long Binh, 1968. The wet season had taken the biggest American base in Vietnam and kneaded it into something ugly. Red mud the color of rusted blood, diesel haze hanging low between sandbag walls, and the constant teeth-grinding fatigue that made even laughter sound like work. Inside the mess hall, though, the war sometimes loosened its fingers. For a few minutes at a time, it was just noise. Tin trays clattering, boots scraping concrete, men arguing over coffee like it mattered, a Navy corpsman trading insults with a Green Beret, a MACV advisor chewing too fast, eyes still scanning doorways out of habit, the kind of ordinary that only exists when everyone is too exhausted to pretend they aren't afraid. The room was packed, shoulder to shoulder with people who didn't spook easily, men who had walked into ambushes and kept walking, men who'd seen friends vanish in elephant grass and still showed up for breakfast the next day because that's what you did. It was loud, it was normal, and then, without warning, it wasn't. If you're still with me, don't blink here, because the moment that followed was small on the surface and enormous underneath. A single Australian soldier appeared in the doorway. No visible rank, no escort, no casual swagger you'd expect from someone strolling into the center of America's war. Just one man, lean and sun-baked, moving with a strange stillness that didn't belong in a room full of jittery combat veterans. He didn't pause to take the room in. He didn't look for friends. He just stepped inside like he'd already decided where he was going days ago. And in the next 2 minutes, maybe less, something happened that Sergeant First Class Raymond Kowalski would replay for the rest of his life. One table stood up, not all at once, not dramatically, but as if an invisible signal had been passed down the line. A chair slid back. A tray was pushed away half-eaten. Then another table. A Navy corpsman who'd been laughing a second earlier stopped mid-breath, set his fork down like it had suddenly become inappropriate, and rose without a word. A Green Beret got up and walked out. Not fast, not panicked, just gone. Meals abandoned, seats emptied, conversations cut cleanly in half. The sound drained out of the space around the Australian like someone had pulled a plug. And then there was this widening circle of silence, spreading outward from him, table by table, as if he carried a sickness no one wanted to catch. Kowalski noticed immediately. He'd been in country long enough to tell the difference between fear and ego, between superstition and professional caution. He'd eaten alongside Korean Tiger Division soldiers who made MPs nervous just by how calm they were. He'd shared cigarettes with Montagnard scouts who slept with blades in their hands like it was a lullaby. But he'd never seen elite American operators evacuate a room like this, quietly, collectively, with no explanation and no insult. Nobody spat a slur, nobody stared him down. There was no hostility in the air. What filled the space instead was colder than hatred, recognition. The Australian crossed the floor and sat alone, as if solitude was the only seat he ever took. He popped open a ration tin without ceremony and began eating like he was fueling machinery, not enjoying a meal. Up close, his uniform looked wrong, not dirty. Everything in Vietnam got dirty. This was different. His fatigues were faded beyond regulation, bleached into the color of dead grass. The cloth had that worn softness you only got from living in it for weeks at a time. His sleeves were rolled with obsessive neatness, like a habit carved into him. Then Kowalski saw the boots, and his stomach tightened. The soles had been cut and restitched, not repaired, reshaped, altered to look like bare Vietnamese feet. Not comfort, not convenience, deception, adaptation. The Australian's movements were precise, economical, almost mechanical. Every motion belonged exactly where it landed, like his body was trained to waste nothing. Not energy, not sound, not attention. And his eyes, Kowalski would later say that's when he understood why the room had emptied. Those weren't the eyes of a man waiting for the war to end. Those were the eyes of someone who had stepped over a line and never found the way back. Kowalski leaned toward the master sergeant beside him, an intelligence veteran with a face like weathered leather, a man who'd been running cross-border work since the early days when half the rules weren't written yet. "What the hell is going on?" Kowalski whispered. The answer came back so quietly it barely moved the air. "Australian SAS," the sergeant said. Then after a beat, like it was the part that actually mattered, "Nui Dat, snake eaters." That was all it took. The men who had left weren't afraid of the Australian, they respected him, and that was exactly the problem. Because sitting at that table meant risking knowledge. Details you couldn't unknow once they were in your head. Methods so effective and so morally gray that some American units treated distance like a form of self-preservation. Plausible deniability wasn't just something lawyers talked about, it was psychological armor. Because once you understood how the Australians operated, you had to live with the question that followed. If it works, why aren't we doing it? Or worse, if it works, what does it cost? The mess hall slowly refilled after the Australian finished eating and walked out without looking at anyone. Trays clattered again. Voices rose back into place. The room pretended the moment hadn't happened, but something had shifted. Kowalski felt it like a hairline crack forming in the foundation of a belief he hadn't even known he'd built. That elite forces fought the same war in the same way, only faster, cleaner, and with better gear. That morning proved otherwise. Those empty seats told a story no official report ever would, a story about effectiveness so absolute it became disturbing. A story about allies who had adapted so completely to the jungle that even America's finest chose distance over understanding. And that was only the beginning, because the men who stood up that morning weren't reacting to rumors, they were reacting to numbers. Numbers whispered through classified briefings, numbers scribbled into annexes and after-action summaries passed hand-to-hand like contraband, numbers that made no sense inside the normal math of war. By late 1968, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment operating out of Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province had a record that bordered on the unbelievable. At least, that's how the Americans described it when they thought no one outside the circle would ever read it. Hundreds of confirmed enemy killed on patrol operations, and in those same patrols, no Australian operators lost to enemy fire, not low casualties, not acceptable losses, zero. In Vietnam, where even the best units measured success in ratios rather than absolutes, it didn't sound impressive, it sounded wrong. American Special Forces, Green Berets, long-range patrol teams, MAC-V SOG recon elements were widely considered the finest irregular warfare soldiers on Earth. They had helicopter gunships on call, artillery support minutes away, logistics so deep it was basically a religion. And yet when analysts compared operations in similar terrain against the same enemy during the same period, the disparity wouldn't go away. American units posted kill ratios that commanders bragged about, 8-to-1, 10-to-1, sometimes more, often at a cost they tried not to dwell on. If you applied those casualty rates to the Australians' operational tempo, the math said the entire regiment should have been wiped out, several times over. But it wasn't just body counts, that was part of the problem. In Phuoc Tuy, enemy activity began collapsing in ways American commanders struggled to measure. Viet Cong main force units refused to move at night, tax collectors stopped visiting villages, supply runners abandoned routes they'd used for months. Captured documents spoke of areas of death, of hunters who cannot be seen. Enemy commanders issued standing orders to avoid Australian patrols entirely, not because they lost firefights, but because they never even knew they'd been in one until it was over. In neighboring provinces, American divisions continued fighting their war. Search and destroy sweeps, battalion-size operations, heavy firepower, big numbers reported upward, and still the insurgency regenerated again and again, like a wound that wouldn't close. Meanwhile, in Phuoc Tuy, it withered. By early 1969, MAC-V headquarters quietly commissioned a comparative effectiveness assessment. Dry, statistical, bureaucratically cautious. Devastating anyway. Terrain differences couldn't explain the gap. Enemy quality couldn't explain it. Support availability actually favored the Americans. The conclusion, written in careful language meant to keep careers intact, acknowledged what a lot of officers already suspected. Australian methods produced operational effects American doctrine could not replicate. And that created a problem no general wanted to own. Because to admit Australian superiority meant admitting the most technologically advanced military in the world was being outperformed by a force 1/10 its size, operating with fewer resources, less firepower, and almost no external support. Worse, it raised the follow-up question that burned like acid. If their methods work, why aren't we using them? The answer lived in footnotes and annexes. Legal risk, political blowback, rules of engagement, and the moral distance American leadership didn't want scrutinized by Congress or the press. The recommendation was clear: do not integrate these techniques, do not formalize them. Maintain operational separation. The report was classified, distribution restricted, its conclusions filed away like an embarrassment. But among the men on the ground, the Green Berets, the intelligence sergeants, the operators who saw the effects firsthand, the truth didn't vanish. It lingered in whispers, in sidelong glances, in that unspoken understanding that some allies were fighting a different kind of war, a war that worked frighteningly well. And if the numbers were that disturbing, the methods behind them had to be worse. To understand how those numbers were even possible, you have to forget almost everything modern doctrine teaches about dominance and momentum. Because the Australians didn't try to overpower the jungle, they surrendered to it. The SAS arrived in Phuoc Tuy in 1966 and built their base at Nui Dat, a former rubber plantation surrounded by scrub, secondary jungle, and village networks that looked harmless on maps and murderous in reality. American planners assumed they'd operate like every other Western force in Vietnam: short patrols, regular radio check-ins, helicopter extraction, fire support on standby. Instead, the Australians vanished. Their patrols slipped into the bush at last light and stayed there for a week, sometimes two. 5 men, no artillery, no air support, radios carried only for emergency extraction, and even then often left silent as a superstition and a strategy. They carried minimal rations. They moved so slowly, American liaison officers couldn't understand the tempo. Where an American patrol would cover kilometers in a day, the Australians measured progress in meters, and the first thing they did after insertion was nothing for 24 hours, sometimes longer. They didn't rest. They studied, they listened. They learned the sound of the jungle when nothing was wrong. The bird calls, insect rhythms, the way wind moved through leaves at different times of day. Only after they understood the baseline did they begin to move. Because any deviation from that rhythm meant human presence, enemy presence. Their movement was deliberate to the point of obsession. Each footstep was tested before weight transferred. Dry leaves brushed aside in advance. Twigs eased downward instead of snapped. Hand signals replaced whispers. Entire conversations happened without sound. They didn't move like men trying not to be heard. They moved like nothing had changed. This wasn't stealth as Americans understood it. Sneaking. This was camouflage in behavior and time, becoming part of the jungle's normal pattern. Tracking elevated it from discipline to dominance. The Australians had trained alongside Aboriginal trackers whose cultures had read land for tens of thousands of years. Those men taught them the ground was a language. A blade of grass bent a certain way meant passage within hours. Disturbed spiderwebs revealed height and body width. Soil compression hinted at load weight. Even insects reacted differently to recent movement. An Australian patrol didn't stumble into the enemy. They found him deliberately, days before contact, and then decided whether contact was worth having at all. American observers found the patience unnerving. U.S. patrol culture was built around action, move, make contact, extract. The Australians were built around presence. They would shadow Viet Cong units for days, memorizing routes, routines, vulnerabilities. Sometimes they never fired a shot. Sometimes they waited for the single moment that would ripple outward the farthest. To American doctrine, it looked inefficient. To the enemy, it felt supernatural. Viet Cong units began reporting ambushes that failed before they were sprung. Supply runners vanished without warning. Camps were found compromised without signs of assault. The jungle itself seemed to betray them. What they didn't understand was simple. The Australians weren't fighting in the jungle anymore. They were thinking like it. And once a force adapts that completely, technology and numbers stop mattering because the fight no longer happens on the battlefield you planned for. Still, patience and tracking only explained how the Australians found the enemy. It didn't explain why the enemy stopped functioning afterward. That answer lived in a place American doctrine rarely stared at for long: psychological collapse. Australian SAS patrols did not hunt firefights. A clean ambush followed by extraction was often considered a failure if it revealed too much. Their goal wasn't decisive engagement, it was disintegration. They turned every contact into a message. When an SAS patrol chose to act, the action was brief, precise, and final. But what came after mattered more than the elimination itself. They didn't rush to extract. They didn't immediately report contact. Instead, they reshaped the scene. Not randomly, not for cruelty's sake, but deliberately, according to principles designed to exploit Viet Cong beliefs about death, spirits, and fate. American intelligence reports avoided details, using sterile phrases like psychological exploitation of battlefield artifacts. The Australians used a darker, simpler term: the ritual. The intent wasn't spectacle, it was ambiguity. Bodies positioned to suggest inevitability rather than violence. Equipment removed or altered to imply intimate knowledge. Signs that suggested the dead had been chosen, tracked, and claimed individually. To Western eyes, it looked meaningless. To Vietnamese fighters steeped in spiritual symbolism, it was devastating. Translated enemy documents from 1967 and 1968 told the story in frightened, formal language. Directives ordering units to abandon areas tainted. Warnings that the enemy could see without being seen. Orders to never move alone, even within secured zones. One story circulated through intelligence channels: a platoon refusing to enter a rubber plantation for weeks after finding the aftermath of a single SAS action. The most damaging effect wasn't fear of the Australians, it was fear of each other. SAS patrols sometimes eliminated individuals selectively over extended periods. Not squads, not camps. One man at a time. The pattern wasn't random. Survivors concluded there had to be an informant inside their ranks, someone feeding names and routes to the enemy. Paranoia followed. Accusations, internal purges. Cells dismantled themselves faster than any outside force could have managed. American officers who witnessed the downstream effects were shaken, not by brutality, but by the cold efficiency of it. A 5-man patrol had achieved what battalion operations couldn't: long-term area denial without occupation, suppression without presence, collapse without confrontation. This crossed a line American forces could see clearly, even if they never wrote it down. U.S. doctrine separated combat from psychological manipulation. SEOP meant leaflets and loudspeakers, not jungle geometry and silence. The Australians had fused the two into something inseparable, a method that didn't just defeat the enemy, it convinced him he was already defeated. Analysts reviewing the outcomes reached a blunt conclusion buried deep in classified annexes. The techniques worked too well. They raised questions about legality, accountability, and moral distance that American leadership was unwilling to defend publicly, so the guidance filtered down in quiet ways. Green Berets weren't ordered to avoid Australian SAS operators, so they chose to, because understanding those methods created an ethical trap. If you knew they worked, if the evidence was overwhelming, then refusing to use them became a conscious decision. And conscious decisions are heavier than ignorance. That's why the mess hall emptied. Not because the Americans feared the Australians, because they feared what knowing would demand. Because once warfare stops being about winning fights and starts being about unmaking people, it forces a question no manual can answer. What are you willing to become? The Australians had a phrase for it: jungle consciousness. To American observers, it looked like something else entirely. SAS operators trained to be alone for weeks, to find comfort in isolation that would fracture most soldiers. They learned to suppress instinctive emotion until killing became technical, an act performed, not felt. Over time, it produced what later psychologists would call a predator mindset, the ability to view human targets not as enemies but as quarry. It made them devastatingly effective. It also made them strange. On base, they were polite, distant, oddly detached. Bonds existed, but they were functional rather than expressive. They trusted each other with their lives but didn't seek reassurance, confession, or release. Green Berets noticed the difference instantly. They admired the results. They respected the discipline, but they understood the price. Long after Vietnam, patterns emerged among veterans of that kind of adaptation. Men who found civilian life too loud, too soft, too unstructured. Situational awareness that never switched off. Emotional flatness that strained marriages and friendships. A sense of being permanently misaligned with normal society. Too quiet, too alert, too removed. The jungle had taught them to disappear, and sometimes, when the war ended, the disappearing didn't stop. This was the line American leadership wouldn't cross. US doctrine prized effectiveness, but not at the cost of identity. The military wanted elite warriors who could return home and become citizens again. The Australian approach worked, but it demanded transformations that didn't always reverse. That's why assessments were classified, why the techniques were never formalized, why the lessons were diluted into safer concepts, long-range surveillance, hunter-killer teams, morale-focused operations, without naming their origin, and that's why Long Binh's mess hall emptied in 2 minutes. The men who stood up that morning weren't afraid of the Australian. They recognized him. They saw what total adaptation looked like. They understood that once you become that effective, something else gets left behind. Some forms of excellence demand a price most institutions are unwilling to pay. And the quietest part of the story, the part that stuck in Kowalski's mind like a splinter, wasn't the altered boots or the bleached uniform. It was the way the Australian ate alone, calm as stone, while a room full of America's best quietly chose distance. Not because they didn't want to know, because deep down, they already knew what they would see if they looked too closely, and they weren't sure they could live with it.